Hey, welcome to the briefing. What I'm going to cover with you today is this: navigate obstacles rapidly in public sector. What happens when the place where government normally delivers the service suddenly becomes unusable, but the government still has work to do? That is the situation I want to work through with you today, because there is a leadership mistake sitting right in the middle of it, and it is easy to make. A building closes, a system goes down, an approval route becomes unavailable. A key person is out. A field route gets cut off. Something that has always carried the work is suddenly gone, and almost immediately people start treating the loss of that path like the loss of the objective. Apparently, the building got promoted from facility to mission commander. Those are not the same thing. A damaged path can stop movement. It does not automatically cancel the mission. As of August 8th, the Kerr County Courthouse in Texas remains closed to the public after severe flood damage affected the lower level of the facility. County offices that normally operated from that courthouse have been relocated to other county facilities. The Tax Assessor-Collector is serving the public from the West Kerr County Courthouse Annex. The county clerk and district clerk are operating from temporary locations at the Hill Country Youth Event Center. Court functions have also been affected. Jury selection and hearings have been moved to alternate locations in some cases. Some county court at law hearings had to be postponed and rescheduled. Commissioners' court activity has also been moved to another facility while the courthouse remains unavailable. Now, I want to be careful here, because there is a difference between using a real event to teach a leadership lesson and inventing a story around people we do not know. The public information tells us the courthouse is unavailable. It tells us several government functions were relocated. It tells us some court activity was redirected. It tells us some activity could not simply continue on the same schedule. It does not tell us every relocation is operating at normal capacity. It does not tell us every delay disappeared. It does not tell us residents experience the temporary locations exactly the same way they experience the courthouse. And it absolutely does not tell us every internal conversation, disagreement, alternative, or leadership decision that happened before those temporary locations were selected. So I am not going to sit here and manufacture some heroic narrative where everybody executed a perfect plan and everything worked beautifully. I do not know that. Neither do you. What we do know is enough. A major county facility became unavailable. The public objectives connected to that facility remained active. Several functions moved into alternate operating locations while the original facility problem remained unresolved. The courthouse is unavailable. County government is not. That distinction matters. One of the easiest mistakes leaders make under pressure is allowing the normal path to become mentally fused with the objective. The office becomes the service. The counter becomes access. The software becomes the process. The normal reviewer becomes the approval. The scheduled route becomes the only route. The assigned room becomes the meeting. The established workflow becomes the operation itself. Then the path breaks, and the leader starts solving the wrong problem. The conversation becomes, how do we get the old path back? When can we reopen? When can we move everyone back? Those are legitimate questions. The courthouse still matters. Repair, recovery, and facility access still matter. But there is another question that has to sit right beside those, and sometimes it has to come first. What still has to happen while that path is unavailable? Think about Kerr County without adding anything that is not publicly established. The courthouse closes. That does not eliminate the need for records. It does not eliminate tax services. It does not eliminate court functions. It does not eliminate public meetings. It does not eliminate county administration. It does not eliminate resident access. The physical path is damaged. The public requirement remains. And that matters because the leadership problem is no longer just how do we restore the building. Restoring the building is still a problem. I was about to say it becomes the secondary problem, but that is not quite right either. It remains a real problem. It just does not get to consume every other objective attached to it. The other question is, what has to continue now? What can move? What cannot move? And what legitimate path can carry the objective while the original path remains unavailable? That is the stronger read, because the building is one path to the objective. It is not the objective. I have learned over time that leaders get themselves in trouble when they become too attached to the method that normally works. And I understand why. The method becomes normal because it works. People know it. Systems and responsibilities get built around it. That creates consistency. But consistency can quietly become dependency. And you usually do not see that dependency until something breaks. That is when you find out whether the organization understands the objective or whether everybody just memorized the route. A team that understands the objective has a better chance of continuing when the route changes. Public sector work makes that especially important because the public requirement does not stop simply because your internal operating environment changed. Residents still call. Applicants still need answers. Records still matter. Public meetings still have consequences. Field work keeps accumulating. Court activity still exists. Service demand does not disappear because your organization is having a bad day. And now that does not mean government should improvise and throw work wherever there is an empty room. People hear redirection and sometimes turn it into just find another way. No, moving something without control is not redirection. It is displacement, and displacement can create the next failure. You can shift the service counter, but that is not really the decision. The decision is whether the new location can responsibly carry the service. You can move a workload and overload another team. You can shift ownership until nobody is sure who is responsible. You can create a temporary process that quietly becomes permanent. The workaround has already requested a budget code. And that is not leadership. You did not remove the burden. You transferred it. And that can become a second problem very quickly. So the point here is controlled movement. You are trying to free the objective from the obstacle without pretending the obstacle disappeared. That is where Kerr County becomes useful. Moving the county clerk does not repair flood damage. Moving court functions does not restore the courthouse. Holding commissioner's court somewhere else does not make the original room usable. The building problem remains. The service problem is different. They are connected, but they are not identical. Under pressure, leaders collapse connected problems into one giant problem. The building is down, so service is down. The system is down, so the process is down. The approver is unavailable, so the decision is impossible. The normal route is closed, so movement stops. Sometimes that is accurate because law, authority, security, records control, due process, technical limitations, or another real constraint leaves no responsible alternate path. Fine, say that accurately. But sometimes the leader has failed to distinguish what is actually blocked from what has historically depended on the blockage. Define the problem too broadly and you eliminate options before you inspect them. Let me give you a simple public sector example. Imagine a county department has always served residents through one central service counter. That counter becomes unavailable. Maybe the building loses power, maybe the room is damaged. Maybe the facility has to close. The exact cause does not matter for this illustration. If the leader defines the problem as the public cannot be served until that counter reopens, the entire service objective is now captive to that counter. Here's what that logic looks like once you stop pretending it is reasonable. The counter has become a constitutional officer. It is unavailable, so apparently the rest of county government has to stand around until Formica reports back for duty. The visual is ridiculous. The service obligation is not. The counter is unavailable. More precisely, the counter is where the blockage became visible. The public objective still exists. So the questions change. What part of the service truly requires that physical location? What requires equipment that cannot be moved? What requires secured records access? What can shift to another county facility? What can be handled through another approved channel? What may genuinely need to pause because there is no responsible alternative? Now we are getting somewhere. That is not a full execution plan. It is a cleaner read. And a cleaner read gives you a much better chance of making the right move. Kerr County also shows an important boundary because not everything moved equally. Some public-facing offices established temporary locations, some court functions moved, and some hearings were postponed. Obstacle redirection is not an ideology where movement is automatically good. Some paths can shift, some can move only partially, and some should not move until the constraints are understood. What matters is the The part that matters here is whether the path you choose can carry the objective under control. The tool does not replace judgment. It keeps judgment from being aimed at a weak read. That is where obstacle redirection comes in. Obstacle redirection is a tool inside Deepen, the decision execution and problem navigation module. At the recognition level, the idea is pretty straightforward. An obstacle is already interfering with the objective. The objective still needs to move. Direct correction is not necessarily the best immediate move, and there is a controlled way to move the obstacle's effect out of the path so progress can continue while the unresolved issue remains owned. That last part matters. The unresolved issue remains owned. If you redirect the work and nobody owns what remains, you did not solve the problem. You made it harder to see. There is a phrase I use for the failure pattern we are looking at here: path captivity. Path captivity is what happens when the obstacle starts controlling the objective because the organization cannot imagine the objective moving any other way. The path starts owning the mission. That is backwards. The path exists to carry the objective. The objective does not exist to preserve the path. And before somebody takes that line and starts running around their organization bypassing controls, let me put a hard boundary around this. Sometimes the path absolutely matters because law, policy, safety, security, privacy, authority, due process, documentation, or chain of custody constrains what can move. You do not route around those controls because they became inconvenient. That is not disciplined redirection. That is reckless. Do not confuse an unavailable method with an impossible objective until you have actually checked the difference. That is the discipline. And that discipline gets harder when pressure starts building because pressure narrows your attention. The visible blockage becomes the entire problem. A resident complaint comes in, a department head wants an answer, an elected official is asking when service will return. Staff want to know where they are reporting. Public-facing information has to be updated. Another department may have space. Some functions can move, some cannot. Some people may be working from temporary employee-only locations. Different parts of the organization may have completely different recovery timelines. Now, the temptation is to solve everything locally. One office moves here, another function moves there, somebody changes a phone number or meeting location, and a supervisor adjusts the schedule. Each move may make sense on its own, but if those moves are not tied back to the same objective and operating picture, you can build a fragmented replacement system without realizing it. Now, every department has its own tiny sovereign republic of truth, and you still have the original obstacle and the uncontrolled workaround. That is why the consequence chain matters. The normal facility becomes unavailable. A public-facing service loses its normal point of access. Residents start looking for the new path. If the public information is weak, calls increase. If the temporary location has lower capacity, wait times may increase. If staff are split across locations, coordination may become harder. If one group knows the new process and another does not, residents start getting different answers depending on who picks up the phone. If a public meeting moves and people do not know where it went, access becomes a trust issue. If one function moves cleanly while another has to pause, leadership has to explain that difference. Now, staff are not only delivering the service, they are explaining the disruption. That extra communication load starts competing with the original service demand. Then the public sees the friction. And from the outside, the public may not see the facility problem, the staffing movement, the capacity shift, the temporary locations, or the internal handoffs. They see confusion. Nothing builds public confidence like an unannounced government scavenger hunt. The physical obstacle is now spread. What started as a facility problem becomes an access problem. The access problem becomes a communication problem. The communication problem becomes a workload problem. The workload problem can become a trust problem. That is the second order effect. And that is why controlled redirection matters. Because the objective is not merely movement. The objective is movement with enough control that you do not create a bigger failure somewhere else. So let me sharpen the question. The question is not, can we move this? The better question is, can we move this under control? Can we move the service without losing ownership? Can we move the workload without crushing another team? Can we move the location without forcing residents to hunt for it? Can we move the meeting without creating a public access problem? Can we move the function without pretending the original obstacle has somehow been solved? Those are better questions. We are not talking about speed for the sake of speed. We are talking about protecting the objective. There are situations where leaders become so focused on removing the obstacle that they allow the objective to deteriorate while everyone waits. That is where obstacle redirection becomes relevant. The obstacle may still need repair, investigation, funding, technical correction, or direct action later, but the objective does not automatically have to stay tied to it. Fixing the thing and freeing the work are different actions. They can happen on different timelines. And this pattern is everywhere once you start looking for it. A permit review is waiting on one authorized point. A field crew cannot use the normal route. A public works operation loses access to a staging area. A community program cannot use its regular facility. A county office loses access to a system. A department has one employee who historically carries a specific task, and that person becomes unavailable. A resident service process depends on one counter, one location, one inbox, one communication route, or one sequence. Now ask yourself, which of those are actually impossible to move, and which have simply never been required to move before? That is a very different question. Leaders sometimes assume something is fixed because it has always been fixed. Well, not always. Sometimes it is fixed because it genuinely has to be. Sometimes it only looks fixed because nobody has ever had a reason to challenge the arrangement. Habit is not automatically policy. Routine is not automatically necessity. Tradition is not automatically constraint. But you have to know which one you are dealing with. You cannot responsibly redirect around something you do not understand. And that is where the larger direct action system matters. Obstacle redirection does not stand alone. CSA improves the read first. What changed, what still works, what information can be trusted, what is actually unavailable, who is affected, what is the objective, and which constraints are real. That is the input. Then deepen helps the leader decide what kind of problem response fits. Not every problem should be redirected. Some should be postponed or stabilized. Some require direct intervention, the right person to engage, deeper analysis, or precise correction. The mistake is treating every obstacle like it has the same answer. Then once the path changes, communication and ownership become critical. That is where TMC starts to matter. If the new PA ownership gets vague, public messaging gets inconsistent, staff do not understand the temporary operating method, then redirection starts turning into drift. And when the environment is unstable enough that multiple paths may be needed, pace becomes relevant. Primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency paths matter because when one operating path has already failed, a responsible leader should ask what happens if the replacement path also comes under pressure. The replacement path has to carry the objective without becoming the next obstacle. That is the system logic. Read first, choose the problem path, protect execution. Do not build the system backward from whichever tool you happen to like. Now, bring this back to your own operation. Where has the normal path quietly become confused with the objective? That is the question I want you to sit with. Not, do you have a backup plan? That is too easy. Where have you allowed a building, a system, a person, a queue, a meeting room, a route, an approval channel, or a process sequence to become so central that the organization has stopped separating it from the objective? Maybe nothing is broken right now. Good. That is exactly when you should look, because once the obstacle is active, you're going to be under pressure, and pressure makes people protect the thing they recognize, the familiar office, route, person, workflow, or system. That feels responsible because it is what has always worked. But when the path is unavailable and the objective remains active, you have to decide whether protecting the old path is now protecting the wrong thing. Let me give you a field level check without turning this 3-hour tour that turns into a 98-episode sitcom. The next time a normal public service path becomes blocked, ask yourself 4 things. First, what is the objective that still has to happen, not what process normally happens, not which office normally handles it, what still has to occur. Second, what is actually unavailable? Be precise. Is the whole service unavailable, or is one location unavailable? Is the decision impossible, or is one approval route unavailable? Is the field operation impossible, or is the normal route blocked? Is the public meeting impossible, or is the regular room unavailable? Third, is there another legitimate path that can carry the objective without violating the controls that actually matter? And fourth, if you move the path, what problem remains behind? Who owns it? What still has to be fixed, recovered, reviewed, or returned to later? Those questions will not execute obstacle redirection for you. They are not the full process or complete decision logic. They are there to stop you from surrendering the objective to the obstacle before you have checked whether the path can move. There is another warning sign I want you to listen for inside your organization. Listen when people say, "We cannot do this because that office is closed." Maybe they are right, but that sentence deserves inspection. Listen when somebody says, "We cannot move until that person comes back." Maybe that person really is the only authorized point. Fine, check. Listen when the team says, "The system is down, so we cannot do anything." Maybe the system genuinely controls the entire service. Maybe it does not. Listen when a department says, "That is how we have always done it." That does not automatically make the method wrong. It also does not make it mandatory. The leader's responsibility is knowing the difference. And there is one more side of this that public sector leaders cannot ignore. A redirected service has to make sense from the public side, not just from inside the organization. Government can convince itself a function has been restored because employees know where it moved. That is not the same as public access. If residents do not know where the service went, the service may technically exist while functionally disappearing. If a meeting moved and the public-facing information is stale, the meeting may be occurring while public trust is taking the hit. If a temporary service location is operating with less capacity, movement has not restored normal conditions. This is why I am not going to turn Kerr County into some clean success story. The public record does not support that. The useful lesson is narrower. The path changed. That is enough. Obstacle redirection is not a promise that every redirected function performs exactly the way it did before. Sometimes the new path is slower. Sometimes it carries less capacity. Sometimes part of the service still has to pause. Sometimes the alternate route exposes another weakness you did not know was there. That does not automatically make the redirection wrong. It means leadership responsibility continues after the move. Movement does not end the job. In some ways, movement increases the leadership requirement because now the organization is operating outside the pattern everybody knows. People need clearer ownership. The public needs clearer information. Temporary conditions need boundaries. The unresolved obstacle still needs an owner, and somebody has to watch for whether the problem simply reappeared somewhere else. That is the part people miss. They move the work and stop thinking. Then 3 days later, another team is overloaded. A new queue appears. Residents are being sent to the wrong place. The temporary process is generating rework. Nobody knows who owns the original issue anymore. The obstacle was not redirected. It migrated. The problem did not disappear. It changed zip codes. Those are not the same thing. I have certainly made versions of that mistake. I have watched work start moving again and felt the immediate relief that comes with movement. The temptation is to say, good, we fixed it. Sometimes you fix the flow, sometimes you just move the problem. Those are different outcomes, and the work eventually teaches you to respect that distinction. So when I say the obstacle does not get to define the objective, I'm not telling you to bulldoze through constraints. I am telling you to maintain control of the problem definition. Do not let the obstacle write the mission for you. Do not confuse where the work normally happens with what the work exists to accomplish. That line is worth holding on to because it applies far beyond Kerr County. A courthouse is obvious because you can see the building, the closure, and the temporary locations. Most path captivity is quieter. It may be one person everyone waits for, one spreadsheet, one approval manager, one contractor, one shared inbox, one permit queue, one field route, one software platform, or one historical sequence nobody has challenged because it never failed badly enough to force the question. And when one employee has quietly become the only thing keeping the entire process upright, congratulations. The organization built a human load-bearing wall. That is not resilience. That is dependency wearing a name badge. That is where this lesson becomes useful. You do not need to eliminate every single point dependency tomorrow. That is not the takeaway. The takeaway is to stop confusing dependency with objective. What you need to keep clear is the objective. Clear enough that when a path becomes unavailable, you can still ask the right question. What still has to move? And that is where the leader begins regaining control. And I want to make one final distinction before I close this out. Moving the service does not solve the building. It frees the objective from the building. That is the cleaner way to understand what we are looking at in Kerr County. The courthouse remains a real problem. Recovery remains a real problem. Temporary locations may have real limitations, and some proceedings could not simply move. Nothing in the public information allows us to say the disruption is over. But multiple government functions are not sitting still waiting for the building to return. That is the operating pattern: normal path blocked, objective still active, immediate restoration unavailable, service path redirected, original obstacle still unresolved. That pattern is what makes obstacle redirection worth recognizing, because the leadership failure is not always failing to remove the obstacle. Sometimes the leadership failure is allowing the obstacle to own far more of the objective than it actually should. When you are ready to go deeper with this tool, go to www.direct-action-system.io/course-directory. Open the course directory, find the course connected to obstacle redirection and deepen, and start there. That is where the deeper application belongs. When the normal path becomes unavailable, protect the objective first. The obstacle may still exist, but it does not automatically get to own the path. Thanks for listening to the briefing.